The Gortyn Code, inheritance. How Cretan law treated daughters. Stone doesn't usually feel progressive, but the laws carved into the walls of ancient Gortyn have a way of surprising you. In the middle of Crete, sometime in the 5th century BCE, lawmakers decided that rules about family, property, and inheritance were important enough to be displayed publicly, line by line, for anyone who could read. Among these rules, the position of daughters stands out, not because they were fully equal to sons, they were not, but because they were far from invisible. In a Greek world where women's legal presence was often indirect or silent, Gortyn speaks clearly about daughters, property, and rights. This matters because inheritance law is never just about money. It is about how a society imagines family continuity, gender roles, and social stability. Who gets land? Who keeps the household alive? Who counts as a legal person? By looking closely at how the Gortyn Code treated daughters, we get a rare and concrete glimpse into a Greek legal culture that didn't fully conform to the better-known Athenian model. The Gortyn Code, a brief context. The Gortyn Code is the longest surviving inscription of Greek law. Written in an unusual boustrophedon style, lines alternating direction, it covers issues ranging from rape and divorce to slavery and inheritance. Unlike philosophical texts or courtroom speeches, this is law in its rawest form, practical, repetitive, and aimed at real disputes. Crete, and especially Gortyn, followed Doric legal traditions. These differed significantly from those of classical Athens. While Athenian law tended to emphasize male guardianship and civic lineage, Cretan law appears more pragmatic, especially when it comes to property. This pragmatism is most visible in inheritance rules, particularly those concerning daughters. Sons first, but daughters are not forgotten. Let's be clear from the start, Gortyn was not a gender-equal society. Sons were the preferred heirs, especially when it came to family land. If a man died leaving sons, they inherited the estate. That part aligns perfectly with broader Greek norms. But the interesting question begins when there are no sons. In Gortyn, daughters did not simply disappear from the legal picture. If a man died without male heirs, his daughters became central figures in the transmission of property. They were not merely conduits through which land passed to distant male relatives, they themselves were recognized as inheritors, albeit within carefully structured limits. This is where Gortyn sharply diverges from Athens. The heiress system, the patroiakos. A daughter without brothers was known as a patroiakos, literally, holder of the paternal property. This term alone is revealing. The law acknowledges that the property remains connected to the father but recognizes the daughter as its legal bearer. However, this did not mean unrestricted ownership. The patroiakos was expected to marry, often to a close male relative on her father's side. The goal was clear: keep land within the oikos, household, and within the kin group. Marriage, in this context, functioned as a legal mechanism to stabilize property transmission. Still, compared to Athens, the Cretan heiress enjoyed a more defined legal identity. In Athens, the epikleros, heiress, was almost entirely a vehicle for producing a male heir, with little emphasis on her own claims. In Gortyn, by contrast, the daughter's rights to portions of the estate are spelled out with striking precision. Division of property, not equal, but real. The Gortyn Code carefully regulates how property is divided between sons and daughters. When both existed, daughters received a portion, typically half the share of a son. This applied to movable property and sometimes to land, depending on circumstances. Half is not equality, but it is far from exclusion. What's remarkable is the consistency. The law does not treat daughters' shares as symbolic or optional. They are obligatory. The text repeatedly insists on specific fractions, leaving little room for manipulation. This suggests that disputes over daughters' inheritance were common enough to require firm legal clarity. In my view, this precision reflects social anxiety. Property fragmentation was dangerous in an agrarian society, but so was injustice within the family. Gortyn tried to balance both concerns by granting daughters legally protected shares without dismantling the male-centered structure of landholding. Control versus ownership. One of the most subtle features of the Gortyn Code is the distinction between ownership and control. Daughters could inherit property, but their ability to manage or alienate it was restricted. For example, a woman could not freely sell inherited land without consent from certain male relatives. This limitation is often cited as evidence of women's legal subordination, and rightly so. Yet it also shows that the law recognized her as the owner in the first place. Control mechanisms exist precisely because ownership is acknowledged. This duality, recognition paired with restriction, defines much of women's legal status in Gortyn. Daughters mattered enough to regulate carefully, not to ignore. Divorce and inherited property. Another striking feature of the Gortyn Code is how it protects women's property in cases of divorce. If a marriage ended, a woman retained ownership of the property she brought into the marriage, including inherited goods. This directly affected daughters, since inheritance was a major source of female property. The law ensured that a daughter's share did not permanently vanish into her husband's household. In practical terms, this meant that daughters could act as economic stabilizers for themselves and their natal families. This is one area where I think Gortyn appears quietly radical. While still deeply patriarchal, it accepted that women could possess property independently of marital success. That idea was not universally embraced in the Greek world. Illegitimate children and daughters. The code also addresses children born outside formal marriage, and here again daughters appear explicitly. Illegitimate daughters had fewer inheritance rights than legitimate ones, but they were not entirely excluded. They were entitled to certain portions of movable property. This reinforces a broader pattern. Gortyn law preferred graded inclusion over absolute exclusion. Status mattered, gender mattered, legitimacy mattered, but rarely did any category result in total legal erasure. Social logic behind daughters' rights. Why did Gortyn treat daughters this way? The most convincing explanation is economic realism. Crete relied heavily on stable landholding families. Excluding daughters entirely would have created constant disputes, encouraged land grabs by distant relatives, and weakened household continuity. By granting daughters structured inheritance rights, the law reduced conflict. It acknowledged biological reality, families do not always produce sons, and social necessity, property must stay productive. In that sense, Gortyn law feels less ideological than Athenian law. It is less obsessed with civic purity and more concerned with household survival. Comparison with Athens, a different Greek world. It is tempting to generalize Greek law based on Athens, but Gortyn reminds us how misleading that can be. Athenian daughters were legally constrained by perpetual guardianship and had minimal direct property rights. Gortyn daughters, while still subordinate, occupied a clearer legal space. I would even argue that Gortyn law treats daughters less as problems to be solved and more as realities to be managed. That difference in tone matters. Limits of progressiveness. Still, we should not romanticize the system. Daughters did not choose freely whom to marry. Their inheritance often served male lineage interests. Their shares were smaller, their autonomy restricted. Yet within those limits, the Gortyn Code stands out as unusually explicit and protective. In a world where silence often meant invisibility, being named in law was already a form of power. The Gortyn Code forces us to rethink simple narratives about women in antiquity. It shows that legal systems could be patriarchal without being simplistic, and that daughters could be legally significant without being equal. For modern readers, the value lies not in celebrating Gortyn as enlightened, but in recognizing how law adapts to social needs. Daughters inherited not because lawmakers believed in gender equality, but because society needed continuity, fairness, and order. Ironically, that makes the system more honest, and more human.